So we're really happy to have this first intervention on emergencies. And so, well, I'll give you the floor to present the ACF strategy on emergencies, and afterwards we'll have a time dedicated to question and answers. So please don't hesitate if you have some questions or if you want some more information on specific points to ask them, and like that we'll have a discussion all together.
My supervisor thinks my English is terrible, and so I've been asked to deliver this presentation in English. What is the difference between reacting versus responding? Don't be shy. I know some of your names. I will start calling your names. Yes?
Maybe in the case of responding, you could consider that there could have some sort of foresight on the situation, whereas reacting is just being in the face of the situation and you have no hindsight on it.
Excellent. That sums it up extremely well. When we respond, it's because we have a certain level of foresight, preparedness, and readiness. So the difference is being ready. Being ready enables us to respond. Readiness today, though, is maybe different than it was some time ago. How many here have read the paper Crossing Borders that came out last year? 1, 2, 3. Well, I see we are going to have to circulate that. You should all send an email to Virginie so that if you want to read that brief paper, she can share it with you.
Well, actually, it will be sent today in the meeting time. Meeting time. So you'll have it today.
Even better. Okay. And what we learned in 2018, just following our global events and responses, is that repeatedly we had trouble crossing borders in real time. We wanted to respond in Kerala, but bringing in expatriates and material goods was really not an option. We saw the same thing as well in Indonesia, and we also saw tremendous difficulties in Yemen, where visas were delayed for months and months and months and months. And of course, finally in DRC, a row between the president and the president of France meant that French visas were blocked for a time. This is a trend, and it's one that's been happening for some time, where we see a greater assertion of national sovereignty. Governments wanting to be more independent, more in control, more in charge of their borders. And this can impact on real-time emergency response at an international level. And that's an important point. But also, a best practice or a fundamental rule of emergency management is manage at the lowest possible level whenever you can, which means having those that are closest to the impact or the effect be the ones leading the response. And it only makes sense because they are the ones with the greatest contextual knowledge, cultural knowledge. They can get there faster than anybody else, etc., etc., etc. There's also a cost benefit to being prepared or ready at the lowest possible level. Savings in international movements of goods and people versus mobilizing at the ground level. And generally, we know when we invest in preparedness, $1 or euro of investment in preparedness can often save €7 or more in response costs. So preparedness in itself is got a cost benefit. Also, we know today, if we continue with this thread of tightening borders, need for preparedness, benefit of preparedness, etc., we also know that many of the places we work now have greater markets than they did 20, 30, 40 years ago. Markets that are able to supply what's frequently needed. We also know that the human resources in many of the countries are stronger today because of training programs, etc., than 20, 30, 40 years ago. So there's a lot of reasons to conclude that it makes sense to invest in preparedness in our countries of operations, in our country teams. But what then is preparedness? What all does that entail? Let's think a little bit about the famous disaster cycle, which we've all seen one form of it or another. Analysis leads to planning, leads to readiness actions, which ultimately leads to alerts, which are tied to our early warning system, which leads to response, and response should lead to after-action reviews. So in this, the vast majority of time is not spent here, but it's in all of the other stuff that allows us to be ready in order to respond instead of to react. Analysis is contextual analysis. This means things such as what are the constraints and restraints in a given context, for example, capacities, weaknesses, etc. Things that prohibit us from doing A, B, or C, things that enable us from doing X, Y, or Z. Planning is simply planning. It is an exercise that's performed by a group of people, and it results in a document. And that document has an overall objective and strategies to achieve the objective, etc. Readiness is carrying forward the actions that are identified courtesy of the planning process. So a plan should have not only your response intent, but it should also lead to preparedness actions, a list of strategic objectives. And these are the things that need to be executed during readiness. And it's important to remember that planning and readiness is a continuous thing. You don't do it one time, shake hands, slap each other on the back, and say, good job, I'm glad we never have to do that again. In fact, the places where we work are so fluid that it must be continuous and ongoing. We must revisit that analysis periodically. We must ascertain if that plan is still intelligent. We have to take a look at the readiness actions that must be performed to make sure that they're the right ones now. Readiness then links to that early warning and ultimately an alert. Being ready means we're in a constant state of being able to respond, not react. Being able to understand what's happening, of course, then means the early warning system has to be functioning and result in alerts that enable us to lean forward. In most every kind of disaster or emergency or event, there is some form of warning time. And if we are monitoring properly, when those little indicators start to tick up, whether it's for a cyclone or whether it's for conflict, etc., we can start to lean forward we can start to pre-position personnel, goods. We can start to take decisions or actions which make us ultimately ready. Planning, however, is done in multiple planes or multiple ways. For a typical ACF country team, what's necessary when we're talking about planning is going to be a strategic level, all hazards response plan. Winston Churchill said, plans are of little importance, but planning is essential. The reality is, we can't plan everything to death. No two situations are alike. And the value of tactical planning, planning deep down and planning everything to death, has little return on investment because it has a short shelf life. Whatever you're mapping out at that micro level will probably be irrelevant in 6 months or 9 months. So this is why we start with strategic level all hazards response plans. Why can we do an all hazards response plan? Anyone? Why don't we do specific threat by threat plans?
Because the situation is not going to be the same.
That's why we can do an all hazard plan?
No, I mean, we can't do an exact plan for every situation. It has to be different, or it has to be something common that can be changed or modified according to the country or the disaster.
Common. Do we restore electrical power grids as ACF? No, we do not. Do we do population security and control? No, we do not. Do we do major infrastructure rehabilitation? No. What do we do? In an emergency, what do we do?
Provide food.
Basics, food, right? What we do inside of an emergency has a limited scope. We're involved in food security, we're involved in nutrition, we're involved in water. And in an emergency, people need food, NFI, clean water, sanitation. So what we do will have limited strategic variance from one threat or one disaster to another. And this is why we can do strategic level all hazards planning. But there are times when we might need to do a contingency plan. What's the difference, do you think, between a contingency plan and an all hazards response plan?
We need changes to development.
Maybe.
A phase in between.
Anybody else want to throw in a try? A contingency plan is going to be threat specific. And rather than being written at a strategic level, you will go all the way down to the tactical level. So the time and effort is going to be greater to produce this. But remember what I said about shelf life. When you get down to that tactical level, your shelf life is going to be less. Which means we're only going to do a contingency plan if we know the threat is imminent. We have great certainty that it's coming. We know what it is and where it's going to strike. That makes sense if you want to invest the time and effort then into something as detailed and tactical as a contingency plan. So, for example, if we had bird flu or something that was coming, and we were highly confident it was going to strike Burma, and we knew it was going to strike in the third quarter of the year, and we anticipated the areas affected would be X, Y, and Z. But we have to have a high degree of certainty in order to invest the time and effort, because it's a lot more detailed. planning for ACF country offices can also involve COOP. What's COOP? Continuity of operations planning. What's the difference between these two plans, a strategic all hazards response plan and a contingency plan, response plan, and a continuity of operations planning?
Well, for tracking crisis, for example, you can use when you are in an emergency, but it's been 1 year and you're in an emergency. So
Sort of.
when you, for example, in the Northern Balkan states, we had to leave, then we came back, then we left again, then we came back. So I would say that we survived the situation.
I think you're on the right track. A continuity of operations plan is when the threat impacts us, ACF. And then we have to figure out how will we continue serving when the threat impacts us. So for example, if we had to evacuate our headquarters mission on the country office, if we had to get out of the capital because the threat was going to take us out if we didn't move. But at the same time, we have to continue running our programs. So these are about response plans. They're sort of outward looking, whereas this is inward looking. What do we need to do to ensure that we can continue to serve when the threat's going to hit us? Imagine Juba in 2013 when the city fell apart and ACF had to evacuate Juba for security reasons. But then we have to continue, right? We've got all those bases. So planning can include different kinds of planning, inward and outward. Some of it's heavier, some of it's lighter. Okay? In addition, we need to be thinking about how the after-action review relates to the analysis and relates to planning. There is a connection between this. When we do the after-action review, we're not doing an after-action review of the ECHO grant. We're doing how did ACF respond to this event? What did we say we were going to do? What did we do? And was it the right thing to do? Was it effective? From that, we can figure out if we were planning in the right direction or if we were planning in the wrong direction. And then we carry forward whatever we've learned into the next cycle of planning. Remembering that planning and readiness is a continuous thing in the places where we operate. The last point I'll make on this, the last piece of this puzzle, links to readiness, which is exercise. Only after you've achieved planning and a certain level of readiness. When we exercise, we are exercising a plan or a procedure or a component of a plan. You don't exercise just for the sake of exercising. So if you tried to exercise before you've done some planning, before you've done some readiness, you're out of step. You're out of time. For ACF, what's exercising going to look like? Well, exercising is a big world by itself. Tabletops, full-scale exercises, a lot of different ways that you can exercise. For ACF, most likely where we want to be in the not too far future is that we're able to conduct a tabletop exercise of the mission's response plan and some of its components. A tabletop exercise is like playing a game. We're sitting around the table, you've got a facilitator who's got the disaster event, plus a series of problems or injects, and as we walk through the event, the ACF team is checking their plan, their intention, and their capabilities against that exercise. It's kind of like a minor stress test, if you will. All right? So, with this in mind, you can see how heavy readiness is. It's a much more complicated thing and requires the vast majority of the ERRU's time today, helping us be ready in country, recalling crossing borders and what we've learned, recalling the strengths that we have in these offices in terms of markets and human capital, recalling the savings when we invest in preparedness and the savings when we respond from a local level, as well as the best practices, which is manage at the lowest possible level. Today, we're reacting in Zimbabwe and Mozambique. And we're probably going to implement. In fact, we are already in implementation phase in Zimbabwe. But we got lucky. We're lucky that we're going to get to implementation in Zimbabwe and most likely in Mozambique, because we're reacting, not responding. And I don't like to be lucky. I like to be ready. With that, I'll stop yammering on. I'll take your questions.
At the analysis and planning stage, I just wanted, I know that most of the plan, they are supposed to be short because the idea is not to have a 50 pages document. Is it taking into account only the capacity at country level, or also all the working relation between HQ and the country team? Because, for example, when we used to, maybe to react to emergencies, we have some hub outside France, we have the team here purchasing things, etc. So is there a will for change?
So in any country office response to a national emergency, inherent in that is some support from HQ. I mean, that could be as simple as the director of operations initiating 250,000 euros to be used by the country team immediately. So the country team is not on its own. But if we think about how the world's changing, the focus has to be building on capacity whereby country offices are capable of leading. Again, the crossing borders problem, the timing issue, the time to mobilize human resources or material resources from an international level versus a local level. And however, we do maintain as an agency the ability to backstop country offices. But more and more, as the world changes in certain ways, the responses necessarily need to come from country-led operations.
So the objective, for example, will be to have preposition stock in each country?
No, not necessarily. Pre-positioning stock it's a risk that you have to accept or not accept. And framework agreements are another way to have access to materials in a short amount of time. And investing in pre-positioned stock comes with risks such as the cost, the maintenance, the staff that have to guard the warehouse, the physical security of the warehouse, the expiration date of the materials, the breakdown of the plastic, if we bought in plastic items. So all of those things have to be carefully weighed before you choose that option. But in some places, they may feel like the threat cycles are so certain and so imminent that it's worth the investment. But that will always be a slight risk.
what happens today if we are in a country where the readiness is not achieved, the readiness phase is not achieved, and then something striking the country, let's see, something coming from our mandate, like famine in sub-Saharan Africa, level 3 emergency. What is happening?
To an extent, we then are reacting. And of course, our mandate as a humanitarian agency is to save lives and reduce suffering. We will do our best to react. Would we be better off if we were ready? Absolutely, 100%. And in some cases, unfortunately, our ability to react won't be realized, and we won't be able to react. Again, the case of Mozambique and Zimbabwe today. We're reacting, we're going to get something done, we're going to help some people, but it's surely not at the scale that we might have been able to do if we were ready. And remember, readiness is a continuous thing. You could almost say you're never ready, because it's an ongoing process, and as the context goes up and down because of its fluidity, there will always probably be something that we're not ready at because of those changes.
What about partnership? Because you're mentioning now what we are doing in Mozambique, but I think it's for a partner, it's not ACF, direct intervention.
I would say that when we use the term partnership, it includes ACF as a respondent to the event. It's true that in Mozambique, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to directly respond. We're not registered in the country. And we are hoping to work through a local partner, and they will be the direct implementer, but I would still consider that to be ACF as a responder in that country, because we're part of that collaboration which enables the delivery of aid.
Well, it's quite difficult to capture, in fact, where exactly is our role when we are talking about emergency. We understand for sure that the readiness process has to go through the mission team, which we fully agree, although we know that there's a big turnover, and as you rightly say, the readiness is never done because hazards might evolve, well, maybe the team might evolve, and but in practice, because in fact what myself, you know, I'm working since a long time with ACF on the field and now here, but I still cannot capture into practice how all this is happening. I don't know if you have any precise example that you can share that for the work that have been done already.
So again, we've rolled out strategic level all hazards planning. The Director of Operations made it compulsory in December, which is the first time in ACF's history that it's now mandatory that every country engages in planning and readiness. That process asks more or less only 12 questions over a period of short meetings with the country leadership team. And it results in us having a response aim, the level of capability that we think ACF should have in a given country. From that, we can determine the gaps. If this is the level of capability we should have, well, here we are today. So this is the readiness that needs to occur between the stated capability and our baseline. And then we need to execute those readiness steps or actions as we can. Of course, recognizing the constraints, financial constraints, time constraints, the fact that we do have staff turnover. So we're working against all of those constraints, but we're doing what we can in a logical and sort of scientific or emergency management-based way. I'm not sure if that helped understanding or not.
Maybe could you please share an example of a mission readiness plan so that we can see what it looks like and The
So-
various steps.
Basically, what are the strategic things we need in a response, to do a response? Macro level strategic capacity. We need stuff, money. We need stuff, we need money, goods, the ability to move, whether it's materials or people. So mobility,
We need the good information in the good moment.
information, and people, right? We understand that to execute a response, there's 5 or 6 macro level stuff that we need to do. So our readiness plan needs to identify, again, the goal, the gap from where we are today, and the capability deficit from those macro things. So if we know that we intend to serve 100,000 people for 4 weeks, et cetera, and we can calculate the cost per beneficiary in a given country based on historical data, et cetera, we can come up with sort of a financial target that we would need to be able to achieve the stated goal, right? And then we can take a look at, well, then how are we going to ensure that we have that financial capability? How will we be ready with that financial capability? And that then becomes what we have to execute during preparedness and readiness. Does that make sense?
So the 12 questions you mentioned for the missions, does this take into account other national stakeholders, maybe like the government, other local partners, that type of thing?
It does. The first question is around constraints, restraints, and assumptions. Now, in the north of Chad, the government won't let us enter into the area because it's a military area, there's military operations. So that informs our planning. The government has sealed off a particular area, right? Later on, as we go through the questions, when we get into the preparedness/readiness part, we talk about positioning. Now, what is positioning for ACF? We have to position for what?
Type of activities and location.
Access, money, humanitarian space, right? This is how we position. And if we're going to be responding, we have to get that positioning not at the onset of the event, but well in advance of the event. It's part of the readiness life, which means participating in the cluster groups and or the working groups, which means getting in front of ECHO regularly so that they understand our capacity and intention, et cetera, getting in front of the government or whomever is controlling acts regularly so that we're expanding our ability to operate in the country. So this is part of, I think, what answers your question, taking into account things outside of ACF itself, government, clusters, constraints, et cetera.
So if there's a government readiness plan, is it integrated with it, or is it done alongside it, or?
So you're right. In many countries, there are other sort of multi-agency plans, and ACF can take into account the stated intention of those plans to help us understand what's our slice of the pie. What can we expect to have to carry? Because we understand from the other major actors, they're going to carry X. Nantini, and then here.
You say we are not really ready, and is there a reason behind it? And you said you would prefer to be ready than just react to the situation. So is it because of money or manpower or?
And prior to my arrival, there was a decision made by the senior leadership in consultation with the board that ACF needed to reimagine its emergency service unit and its approach to emergencies. So we then went through a process of, okay, well, how do we take the emergency unit and reconfigure it so that it helps us be more ready? So this was just sort of the evolution of ACF in terms of moving more time and effort towards readiness. And you know, we're starting out. We've got to walk before we can run. And right now, I'm not even 100% sure we're walking, but we're getting there.
Okay.
Yeah, Pat. Oh, sorry. All right, Patrick, she's deferring to you.
So where does the preparedness or readiness in terms of capacity and expertise of the mission to respond itself come into the planning process? Meaning that if we're trying to limit, or we are being limited in terms of having people going out to the field to support, do we take into account extra training or in recruitment of staff or things like that? Does that fall into this planning process, or?
So every country preparedness action plan will have its unique measures that need to be executed. Some of it will include training. Some of it could include help with security access or whatever it is. Where we're heading, and this is something that the COMEX will be discussing hopefully very soon, is what we call the readiness gap system. Basically, we know ACF is operational at the country level. Therefore, all efforts around readiness should be intended to support the country office and/or team. Now, there are several ways that we get information on readiness gaps. One is through the planning process. We understand what the readiness gaps are. But on a daily basis, for example, emergency requests come in to Virginie, and as a result, she can start to see trends in gaps in our country readiness, and she can feed that back as well. But then we also have the depth, and we have the logistics department, and the human resources department, and they also have ideas on how we need to evolve systems or whatever to be more ready. And finally, we're going to get onto the business of a global catastrophic response plan, which will also inform us of where our gaps are. So, all of these folks, these parties, will input into a readiness gap system, where we can identify the most urgent things that need to be addressed, the things that are systemic, they're happening all over the place, versus the things that are happening in one place, etc., etc. And this will allow us to triage, prioritize, and treat readiness gaps for ACF. Again, always recalling that here is the end client, because this is where we're operational. And one of the things that we have to be wary of is pancaking the country office. Having so much readiness business that it literally crushes the country team under the sheer volume and weight of actions, which is why the gap system must prioritize. I might have brilliant ideas. You might have brilliant ideas. We all might have brilliant ideas. But if we all run forward with those brilliant ideas at the same time, we collapse readiness.
So for example, does that mean that you work today with HR departments in order to have this interaction and prepare?
And we work...
Yeah, with different departments, it's something, because it's a structural change also.
This is something that the COMEX is going to be discussing. Right now, I work bilaterally, or my team works bilaterally, with the initiatives that the COMEX has approved. So for example, the internal roster was an approved initiative, and the team works closely with the human resources department, et cetera, et cetera. So we're in the process of standing up a global readiness system, which includes planning, readiness actions at the local and global level based on analysis, ultimately exercising, after-action reviews, etc.
My question was whether you have, for example, an example of a readiness plan from an example country where you have been already supporting, so we can visualize. Maybe, I don't know whether after the lunch talk we are going to have any documentation or presentation, something, I don't know. And whether, and my second question is roughly whether there's a kind of action plan of the FU unit, so we can see all these big steps, because now, for example, the global gap system for me is new, and I think it's very nice, it's really good, but how do you plan to advance throughout all these steps?
So this system is something I've proposed. I believe it's what's needed for ACF so that we don't pancake our country offices for readiness. And the COMEX will debate this at the appropriate time. And only at that point will I be informed if we're going to move forward with this or not. So that's the status of this system. It is in process, if you will. I don't have a country plan on me right now, but swing by. I'd be happy to show you something in terms of if you want to see visually how it looks.
Visually, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm having a hard time to envision what you're talking about, this readiness system. How do you see it come to life in reality? Like, how do you envision this system? With which tools? Do you envision a new team entirely focused on readiness? How will this concretely take place here?
So we have a readiness team in the emergency unit now. We didn't before, but we do now. And it would be that team that would lead this system. And in fact, the bulk of staff in the emergency unit today works in planning and readiness, more than our other areas. So this team is there. We have some country planners who are out executing planning with the country offices, etc. We have a couple of global readiness staff who are developing the necessary things we need at a global level, whether it's partnerships, money, people, etc. So the team's there. That's the good thing.
Is emergency response related to long-term development programs in ICF today? And how? Yes.
I would say that if ACF in its sort of blue sky programs, right? That's that 12-month or 18-month project that you've developed with ECHO or DFID or whatever. I would say if we are not considering the threats in that given country and or context, then the work we're doing to aid or assist development can be undermined. So in all of our programs, we should be aware of the threats in that area. Does that make sense? I mean, we can make bad choices. If we don't understand the threats that population faces, we could make a bad choice that could actually set them back as opposed to help them move forward. Yeah. Yep.
So I've got a bit of a linked question. So I'm very new to ACF. I've been here 2 weeks, and I don't fully get the philosophy of the organization yet in terms of emergency response, because you just said blue sky programming 12 to 18 months. In a number of organizations, that's called humanitarian programming, right? And my question basically is, with the whole question of nexus and blurring the line between emergency, non-emergency, and what we're doing here internally is moving our mandate a bit. like how do you position the whole readiness work within this not so clear line between the two? Like how do you, like, for instance, say, well, that triggers the contingency planning, or that doesn't? I mean, I guess it's part of the plan itself, but like how do you articulate this whole?
When we think about emergency response, it's about that first wave of action related to an event.
Right.
So if we take the case of the cyclone that's impacted Zimbabwe and Mozambique, right now we're looking at operations that are be running between 30, 60, maybe 90 days maximum. But then the next round of funding or money will be that 18-month recovery program or that 3-year recovery program that somebody funds. So for us, when we're talking about that emergency response, it's that critical first wave.
So it's mostly sudden onset. Because I'm thinking of like low intensity, like Ebola kind of response. Those are really difficult to deal with because they can last for a while, but intensity-wise, it's always really hard to predict, right?
So it deals with contagion that can rapidly spiral out of control. We need to treat a cholera outbreak like an emergency because cholera can spiral. Same with Ebola. And same with the cyclone. Same with conflict. In reality, sometimes the humanitarian community has to treat famine like a rapid onset event because it failed through the previous 9 months to mobilize. It let the people slip further and further and further and further until they reach the point where they've lost coping capacity.
Right.
Once they've lost that coping capacity, you're in an emergency.
So that'd be your trigger.
You know?
It's more about the capacity to cope with the situation. That's when you would like turn the switch on and say, well, here we go. Now we're executing that plan.
Yeah. And the idea, if we think about the terms blue and gray, blue is what we do on a daily basis. It's that 18-month program. We have a team. We have a work plan. We're executing. Gray is when we hit that flashpoint or trigger point, and now we have to react, or better yet, respond ASAP. All right? But we always aim to get out of gray as soon as possible. Now, how do we get out of gray? There's limited options. One, we finish the 30-day water trucking, we stop, and we're done. Now we're out of gray. We hand over to a partner. We do our 45 days, and then we turn it over to the local NGO. Or we stand up a new base with a new team. Once we've done that, we've normalized, and we're back to blue, right? As far as thresholds, which is it's a great question, the definition of disaster, the definition of disaster for us, it's different for every agency. If you work for a feline rescue agency, then your definition of disaster is going to be around cats, right? Well, we're not a feline rescue agency. So our definition is concerned with human beings. So the definition of disaster for us is going to be something has happened, people have been impacted, and they have immediate basic needs. Basic needs are what? Food, water, shelter, the things that we need to stay alive. And the local capacity cannot cope. So they themselves cannot cope, nor can the local church, mosque, synagogue, whatever. Local capacity can't deal, right?
How far do we help local partners to be able to react? Which means what you present was very interesting, but it's in fact our way to intervene, to be proactive, okay, to be ready. But what type of work do you suggest to facilitate the local partners to react themselves inside the readiness?
In Nepal, for example, ACF can't do direct implementation. It's the way the government has decreed things. So we work through local partners. In that context, when you're doing your planning, your analysis, you should have concluded that we will be working through local partners. And thus, when we're doing the analysis and planning, we determine what do we need to do as ACF to help the local partner be ready. And then you would carry out that, whatever it is, capacity building, training, systems improvement, whatever it is that the local partner needed, would be part of your readiness actions that were outlined in your planning and listed in your preparedness actions. Does that make sense?
What happens if we were not engaged in a country where there's a major humanitarian crisis? Or we don't have local partners, and we don't work there? So does that mean that we're not going to intervene? What's our...
Well, that definitely sounds like a scenario where we're reacting. And then it's a matter of, can we or should we respond, react? Is there need? Is there space? Would we have the permissions required to do it? In all likelihood, North Korea is in a constant state of humanitarian warning point and simmering, right? And lately we've seen that simmering is getting a little bit higher and higher, right? But if something trips tomorrow, it's probably unlikely that we would be allowed to go into North Korea. In fact, Virginie just had a phone call with an NGO that is working in North Korea, and what that NGO communicated back for ACF was not positive, meaning it doesn't look good for ACF being able to get in. But in a case like Mozambique, we haven't been operational there for almost 20 years. We're not registered, but we happen to have a local partner that we'd worked with some time ago, and we're managing.
Years ago? How long have you had? It was like 20 years ago.
Yeah, it was like 20 years ago that we worked with them. We touched base with them in 2016, so there'd been some modestly recent contact, but yeah, it's been a long time. That's why I'm saying we got lucky. We weren't ready.
The early warning system, who is doing the monitoring on the countries in your team?
So Virginie monitors at a global level. When we execute the planning process, one of the questions is, all right, who within the country team is best positioned to monitor the context, to follow on the threats, and then help the country team be alerted as threats start to bubble up.
So she has a kind of like a motherboard with different indicators that she follows in countries?
She follows the globe. So it's not just where we're operational, but where we're not.
By country or by region? How
globally. The only countries that she's not following are those countries where we would logically not be. So logically, we're not going to respond probably in Canada. It's not a country where logically ACF would be a humanitarian operator. But she otherwise follows all other countries that would logically be somewhere ACF responds. We of course understand Spain and New York have certain countries, so her attention there is not so much. Maybe she reaches out to Spain for a little bit of update on Venezuela, et cetera, et cetera. Where we would like to be is having a stronger connection between the monitor in our countries of operations and at the global level. And that's something that we're working out with the regional directors, but it's in process. So she has some constraints.
No, because there's also information. Myself, for example, I'm working closely with IPC, and I hope that, for example, IPC analysis are part of the indicators that comes up to this monitoring.
Mhm.
So we can also provide some information.
She's happy to have sources of information. So if you want to talk to her and recommend sources or be available to provide real-time information, she'd be happy to receive it.
Just about the type of assistance, you spoke about water and nutrition, but what about medical care and health approach? Because now WCF is supposed to do as well health. Are you considering as well to extend our expertise in medical care?
So there's still an ongoing dialogue about the parameters of health, and that's the state of that. I know that we're, Caroline has been working on a new vision and or policy, etc. And then after that, there would need to be a rollout plan, etc. But
new policy for
So this is for epidemics.
That's only for epidemics.
epidemics.
But I'm speaking about basic primary health care, for example, that you could provide during emergency.
If
It's already part of our framework.
yes, if it is part of our core services and meets with what we would say a service delivery plan is, it would be something we would do. Yes. Nothing else? Then I think we're done. Fantastic. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.